7th chapter of the book of Romans. I read this part of the chapter last week. I'm going to read it again, and then we'll jump into some more comments on it, and then we'll read the next section as well and start discussing that. So I'm going to be reading tonight verses 7 through 12 of Romans 7. And Paul says here, "What shall we say then? Is the law sin? Certainly not. On the contrary, I would not have known sin except through the law. For I would not have known covetousness unless the law had said, 'You shall not covet.' But sin, taking opportunity by the commandment, produced in me all manner of evil desire. For apart from the law, sin was dead. I was alive once without the law, but when the commandment came, sin revived and I died. And the commandment, which was to bring life, I found to bring death. For sin, taking occasion by the commandment, deceived me, and by it killed me. Therefore the law is holy, and the commandment holy and just and good." All right, and again, Paul is often very confusing, the way he writes things. And so we're going to pick up here, kind of talking about verse 9. He says there that he was once alive apart from the law. And when we read that statement at its face value, we see that could be somewhat problematic because Paul, like every Jewish boy, there wouldn't be any without a knowledge of the law, let alone someone who had been trained to be a Pharisee. But when we understand it in the context that Paul is trying to share here, it doesn't mean that he didn't have an awareness of the law, but rather that he hadn't realized the full force and the full depth of the law's demands. And so therefore, it kind of lacked personal conviction of his sin. But then when he talks about when the commandment came, sin revived. When Paul finally felt the full meaning of the law, with its motivation aspects, the law jumped to life for him, and he realized that he was indeed a sinner, although maybe not one who did evil things. He realized that there was sin still in his members. He was still sin in his heart and his mind. Would someone read Psalm 119, verse 96? Psalm 119, verse 96.
I think I've got it. 119:96.
Uh-huh.
I have seen the consummation of all perfection, but your commandment is exceedingly broad.
All right. The end of that there, thy commandment or your commandment is exceedingly broad. That is the way the psalmist is saying that basically the same thing that Paul realized here, that when we read about God's law, it isn't just these simple commands, that the law in itself is very broad in its principles. Didn't Jesus kind of share the same thing when he was being questioned about what was lawful in different situations, and he was like, you don't understand. If you hate somebody in your heart, you've committed murder, and if you've thought lustfully, then you've committed adultery. And so Jesus as well has this idea that these broader principles the law is broad. It's not just these narrow things. And so when Paul is talking here, that's what he became aware of. He realized the full extent of the law. Now, sin had always been there in his heart, but in the full light of the commandment, he of course, like we talked about before, he focused on the commandment about not coveting. In the full light of the commandment not to covet, he could recognize it for the first time for what it was. He had come to see the full depth of the commandment. He had also begun to realize that he was indeed a sinner in spite of his good life, and good life there in quotations, and his sinful pride in his own righteousness. And so he realized that, there's this law about coveting, and I thought I was doing pretty good, and now I realize, well, I'm probably not, because I got it in my heart still. And so the result, he says here, I died. Now, that's not the death that, that death to sin that he talked about back in Romans 6:2. Instead, it was a death to his spiritual pride and his self-confidence and his self-reliance. He realized his hopelessness, that the law, when he really understood it, it kind of left him stripped naked, if you will, where it was like, there's nothing for me to hide behind. There's nothing for me to point at to say, oh, look how good I am. Look how righteous I am. Kind of left him empty. So when go ahead.
Well, Pastor, I think he came to the realization that the law is the very character of God. And though he had the law on paper, he didn't have the character of God in his heart.
Correct.
That he was lacking something, as we all are.
That's exactly right. Yes, that law awakened that in him of going, man, I'm really messed up. Yeah.
Right.
And so, in verse 10, when he says, the very commandment that was intended for life brought death, he was correct. When he said the commandment promised life, God created the law as a standard of righteousness and a guide to the good life. Like I tell people often, if you want to live the abundant life, life and more abundantly that Jesus said he came to give us, well, if you're obedient to what the law says, you're going to have that life. It's just going to be a better life overall. It's going to be good. And God created it as a guide to goodness for us. Its purpose, though, kind of shifted after the entrance of sin, because then it also became the role of helping us less than perfect people, identifying where we've gone wrong, where we've wandered away, where we need Jesus even more because we lack so much. And then we have this added issue when Adam and Eve sinned and sin was brought in, because all of us now, we are sinful people, and we are not able to keep the law in our own strength. It's impossible. Because we are born with a nature that just seems to run towards sin so often. And so that's where the deceptiveness of sin entered. Yeah.
We gravitate towards sin.
Exactly. The deceptiveness of sin comes in here, and it suggests kind of that we sinners can become good enough to atone for our wrongs or our righteousness through obeying the law. And with that line of thought in mind, by the way, we have to recognize there that idea, that concept in itself, that we are able to do enough good to atone for our wrongs, that is a sin-based thought pattern. That is not a pattern based in righteousness and belief in God.
Right.
Now, with that line, what was that?
Looking at self.
Yeah, exactly. So with that line of thought in mind, Paul writes that sin, taking opportunity through the commandment, deceived me, and through it, it killed me. The lie that Paul had swallowed in his Pharisaic upbringing and his training was that he could become righteous by keeping the law. He could be a Pharisee of the Pharisees, and that was good. And he was holy then. He was righteous. But that deception, it blinded his eyes to the fact that in a sinful world, as he said in Romans 3:20, no one is justified by works of the law, since through the law comes knowledge of sin. Paul's argument here in Romans 7 verse 11 is that since the law appears to be the way of life, when it actually isn't, sin, kind of uses that misunderstanding to bring about condemnation and death. But that conclusion, though, doesn't mean the law is bad. Doesn't mean that we just throw it out and get rid of it, because he says here in verse 12, the law is holy. Commandment is holy and righteous and good. So here Paul has kind of come full circle in the argument that he's been presenting since verse 7, in which he pictures his opponents asking if the law is sin. Sin may have abused the law, and sinners, we have put it to wrong use at times, as Paul talked about here in chapter 7, verses 8 through 11, but that's not a reflection on the law of God itself. And so Paul here is trying to let his readers and let us know that it is sin that is the culprit, and the law itself is as good as things get. In fact, for the rest of the chapter, he uplifts the law, calling it spiritual in verse 14 and good in verse 16, while claiming that his inner man delights in it in verse 22. And speaking of some of those verses, we're going to go on here reading verses 13 through 20, and then we'll start talking about those as well. So when we pick up in verse 13, it says, has then what is good become death to me? Certainly not. But sin, that it might appear sin, was producing death in me through what is good, so that sin through the commandment might be exceedingly sinful. Often in Paul's writings, I have to read it 2 or 3 times and almost do a diagram to see where he's going with some of these things.
Yes.
So he goes on in verse 14, for we know that the law is spiritual, but I am carnal, sold under sin. For what I am doing, I do not understand. For what I will to do, that I do not practice. But what I hate, that I do. If then I do what I will not do, I agree with the law that it's good. But now it is no longer I who do it, but sin that dwells in me. For I know that in me, that is in my flesh, nothing good dwells. For to will is present within me, but how to perform what is good, I do not find. For the good that I will to do, I do not do. But the evil I will not to do, that I practice. Now, if I do what I will not to do, it is no longer I who do it, but sin that dwells in me. You hear this struggle that Paul is going through here that I think all of us have struggled with in our lives, haven't we?
Yes.
This is a portion of Romans that is quoted often and referenced because it speaks to us, because we struggle so much with seeing the fact that the things we know we should do, we end up not doing. The things we know we shouldn't do, we end up doing. And so, we saw that Paul, concluded the previous paragraph by declaring that God's law is holy and righteous and good in verse 12. He doesn't have any doubt about its goodness. But as he did in Romans 6:1, 6:15, and 7:7, he kind of moves his presentation forward by anticipating what might be one of the arguments that people would give against what he is teaching in this section here. This time we could probably, maybe paraphrase the question is something like this. So Paul, you say the law is good. Well, did that good law become a cause of death? And as with the other questions, he rejects that idea just strongly with an aggressive never, may it never be. It was not the law that caused death, but sin. And how did sin accomplish the task? Paul's answer is that it used the good commandments to bring about condemnation. And how did the law perform that function? And that's because it identifies sin for what it is. So the law has this good and healthy function of pointing out the wrong and it should not be blamed for the crimes or the failures itself. All blame belongs to sin, which motivated wrong actions and violation of the law and disobedience. But in verse 13 here, chapter 7, he doesn't stop with identifying the function of the law, the good law. He goes on to express its magnifying role. The idea that in the light of the law, sin is shown to be exceedingly sinful. Sin not only brings death, but it also makes a mess out of human existence. There's many times where we can justify, if you will, small sins, small infractions, little things, little violations of the law, and think, oh, no big deal. As long as it, didn't do something really horrible, it's not so bad. But what Paul is saying is, no, the law, in its real understanding, points out that sin is exceedingly sinful. Even the slightest sin, the smallest sin that we would see here, would have been enough to have Jesus go to the cross. And so we can never downplay sin and say sin's not that bad, sin's not that sinful. And the law helps to show that by magnifying its fullness, its full principles. So, Paul's conclusion is as clear as it can be in verse 13. The good law did not bring death, but it was sin that used the law for evil purposes. So then we have to ask this question: how could the law do something like that? And the answer to that begins in verse 14 with the word "for," and of course that signals the start of the explanation. So Paul's first point is a highlighting of this tension between the law, which is spiritual, and human beings who are sinful. And he uses human experience as an illustration of that struggle. And then we arrive at one of the most controversial parts of the book of Romans. Most of the debate concerning here chapter 7, verses 14 through 25, it centers on who the I is, whether it is Paul or whether it is referring to people before they become Christians or after they've done so. And that debate, that's not Paul's concern. His interest instead in trying to explain this, it focuses on the law and how sin uses it to cause death. There are some people who will read some of the verses that we just went through. I struggle basically in my, and I struggle with these things, and I do what I don't want to do, and I don't do what I know I should do, and so there are some people who say, well, that only is for that was Paul before he was truly converted. And after he was converted and was a real Christian, then he didn't struggle with those things. I think many of us can say we've been followers of Jesus for a long time, very dedicated, and we still ask those questions. We still struggle with it, I think.
Yes.
So, when we understand Paul's true interests here, it doesn't release us from the necessity of trying to understand what he's saying here in terms of what they might imply about human nature. And here
Pastor,
go ahead.
Pastor, verses 24, and I don't want to jump ahead of you, 24 and 25, it is the key to the whole thing. O wretched man that I am, who will deliver me from this body of death? And then he says, I thank God through Jesus Christ. What a relief. Our Lord. I thank God through Jesus Christ. So
exactly.
The key to the whole thing is keeping our eyes fixed upon Christ, and not on ourselves.
Yep.
Looking to Christ, the author and finisher of our faith.
Yeah, exactly. And we also see this progression too from verse 14 this idea of this carnal person, to verse 22, which is describing someone who delights in God's law. And so we see that this I that Paul is talking about here, it represents, an idea of someone caught between good and evil, wanting, desiring the good, which comes from salvation. If we even have this heart that says, I want to do what's right, I really do want to obey, that's evidence that God is in our heart, because we wouldn't even have the desire if the Spirit wasn't dwelling in us.
Yeah.
And so the best way to understand, to see the solution, is to see the I in this passage that Paul has as a true Christian when they have fallen into sin. Condition we have to understand, it isn't the full picture of a Christian life. Since Romans 6 declares that Christians are not slaves of sin, and the victory aspect of the Christian life is clear in chapter 8, but here in chapter 7, he's talking here about individuals who know the good, but cry out in anguish about their wretchedness when they don't do what they should, or do what they know they shouldn't. And it's okay. Even in Steps to Christ, it talks about there'll be many times that we will have to fall at the feet of Jesus, weeping. And so that's kind of what he's describing here. Oh, wretched man that I am, man, why did I do this again? And so nearly all of this we're talking about here, of the I problem of Romans 7, kind of comes from the fact that people bring their reading of the text, their own theological agendas. People sometimes do have theological agendas. There's one thing, though, to argue at the level of theology, but it's quite another to read it from the perspective of our human experience. And we have to realize that while the Bible is a theological book, it is all centered around our human experience and what we go through on a daily basis, and our relationship to Christ and to the Father and the Holy Spirit, and how they're working in us and through us and for us and with us, and how we interact with that. And so, the text here doesn't accurately reflect every Christian life in the real world. All of us have ups and downs, and we go through different things. But we do know that no believer is completely without sin. We are all caught in this tension. So this reference to I is kind of reflecting this universal experience among all believers, and Paul kind of illustrates that in his own life. And so when we read it, it's best to read the text for what it actually says, without using it. We don't want to support ideas that aren't central to what Paul is trying to explain here. Now, to understand even more of Paul's expressions, we need to understand as well how we feel when we fall into doing what we know is wrong, in spite of what we would like to be. And we often feel like just kicking ourselves, don't we? We're just like, man. Especially, it seems.
I can't believe I did that.
Yeah, I can't believe I did that. And I don't know about you, but I often find that experience after a spiritual high. Where, we've had this really good mountaintop experience, everything is good, and then we come crashing down the other side, and the devil is right there to say, see, you're a fake, you're false, why'd you even try? This is just, you mean nothing. You're just an absolute failure.
Yes.
Yeah, he is the accuser, and he seems to love doing it.
He piles it on.
Oh, yes.
So,
as we realize that Paul here isn't describing the entirety of a Christian's life, even if our lives are ones that are generally victorious, maybe even more victorious than not, and we have a peace and a joy, and we exercise faith. There's other times when we still identify with Isaiah. He said in Isaiah 6 verse 5, woe is me, I'm a man of unclean lips. Or we might identify with Peter. We know that he he fell at Jesus' feet and he said, "Depart from me. I'm a sinful man. You shouldn't even be around me. I don't. You need to get away." And so Paul brings forward his argument related to how come the good law is not responsible for death. And he does that in two stages in Romans 7, verses 14 through 25. After he kind of introduces this tension in verse 14, the argument moves from that fact in this way. It's one, he does that which is evil in spite of his good intentions. Then he goes from there to he cannot do that which is good in spite of his desire to do so. So he's going, I do what is wrong, but my intentions to do what's right, and I don't do what's good, even though I really desire to. And for each of those, he arrives at the same conclusion, and that is that the entity, the part or the thing that is causing the problem is not the law. He says the problem isn't the law that's doing this. It's the sin dwelling in me. And he repeats that same idea in verse 20. The exact Greek words actually is sin dwelling in me. That's what he literally says. Meanwhile, he kind of talks about the law again is good in verse 16. And so then his conclusion is very certain. He's nailed it down from both directions. He does evil and fails to do good for the same reason, and that's there's sin that still dwells in him. So he exonerates the law from all guilt, and successfully he's defended the proposition that he set forth in verse 12, that the law is holy and the commandment is holy and righteous and good. And then he's answered questions that may have arisen of verse 13. Did that which is good become a cause of death to me? And then he moves beyond the mere declaration of that fact, may it never be, to this demonstration of his claim that it is sin working through the law that was the culprit. That was the problem. So now he has put these, explained the problem. He advances this next stage of his argument in verses 21 through 25, in which he cries out, "Who will deliver me from this body of death?" And then we'll get into it later, but he kind of gives that answer in the next chapter in Romans 8. But before we finish here in verses 13 through 20, we need to talk about and note that sin is not the only problem that those verses highlight. The other thing that's highlighted there is that humans, even converted Christians who love God's law, we are not beyond the realm of sin. And he brings that thought out by two words that are found in verse 14. The first is slavery, alluded to by the words sold under sin in verse 14. The author, James Denny, he points out that slavery is the only way to explain the situation, since a slave is one who is the instrument of another's will. And sometimes we do things that we shouldn't do, and it just seems like there's something else controlling us, and there is that sin nature that we still struggle with getting completely free of. But then we also need to be careful here, though, because Romans 6 plainly teaches that Christians are not slaves of sin, but of righteousness, and that sin is not to reign in our lives. And that is true. But as Paul has demonstrated, each of us in our own lives, we've seen, we have a difficult time staying totally surrendered in spite of the fact that we now as Christians hate evil and love good. And even though we want to do good and avoid evil, we still fall back under that problem of sin from time to time. Even as we hate our very actions and then repent of them. It's like, yes, I have freedom, and then I go right back to it. Like it says in the Bible, a dog returning to its vomit. And it's like, wait a second. I didn't want to do this, but I did it anyway. And the author, Leon Morris, notes this: sin is no longer the honored guest that it used to be before conversion, but a squatter. Not legitimately there, but very difficult to eject. I know there are different people I've talked to who are, have been landlords of some very, very bad renters, and they have really struggled at times of having those people evicted. And so that's the image that's being shared here about, of the sin nature in us, that before we knew Christ, hey, we welcomed it. It was good. We like it. But now, after we know Christ, after we have experienced salvation, sin just kind of says, "I think I'll just hang out here. This is a nice place. I'm just gonna stay here for a while." And we're like, "No, get out!" It just doesn't seem to happen as easily and as completely as we'd like. And so we have to ask,
Yeah.
on what basis does it remain? And so then we come to Paul's second concept here as he deals with this problem of sin in our lives. Because in verse 14, he points out that it is the flesh. Greek word there is sarx, S-A-R-X, that is connected to sin slavery. And flesh, in Paul's writings, does not refer to bodily tissues, but to a person's lower nature. And I have to tell you, that is something that has been misunderstood by Christians over the centuries. Back in the Victorian era and a lot of the Catholic influence, very much taught that anything of the body was evil and anything of the mind or the spirit was holy and good. And so it was looked at that any of the physical desires you may have, well, that's just wickedness. And that is not a good understanding of what Paul was writing here.
That's why the popes got into so much trouble.
That is why the popes got into so much trouble. Absolutely.
Yeah.
But it also led to some very interesting things. I don't want to go too far, but does anybody here know the reason why John Harvey Kellogg created cornflakes?
Pigs.
What's that?
Stacy said to feed the pigs.
You ever see that movie, Kellogg's?
Yes.
When they first started making cereal, they were testing it out on their pigs. He had pigs there.
Yeah.
They took something that they made out to the pigs and they wouldn't eat it. Anyway, I'm just thought I'd throw that in. That's probably what you want to know.
No. In reality, when he made it, there was some of this mindset here that we're talking about of anything of the body is evil, and he developed it wanting to make a very bland cereal because he believed that by men eating it, their sexual passions would be tamped down because it wouldn't be stimulating at all. And so it was this idea that anything of the body, any even sexual desire was evil and bad, and you had to kind of put it at bay. So that's why he created the cornflakes to begin with. Of course, then over the years they add all kinds of sugar and other stuff to it, and yeah. Anyway, but it was that kind of mindset that has very much it was very much in the Christian churches. Even into society in England, especially, was that idea. But that's not what Paul is talking about here. When he says the flesh, it's that lower nature. It's that nature to do what we shouldn't do, what God disapproves of, and says this is not good. This doesn't lead to abundant life. And so when we read Romans 7, these verses here, we have to remember that they are not talking about the better times in the Christian living. Paul is not saying that Christians never do right or that they do evil habitually, but he's saying that we aren't always as free from sin and the errors of sin as we'd like to be. And so by using that slavery metaphor, he kind of expresses the thought that he still finds sin to be a powerful force that he hasn't managed to resist at every moment. And that thought lines up with biblical understanding that sanctification is the work of a lifetime. And
Yeah.
God is still doing that work in us.
Yes.
Now, the
As long as
good
we're not
news.
looking at ourselves.
Yeah, exactly. And that's the good news here as we finish up, is that we shouldn't be discouraged. We are going to have our ups. We are going to have our downs. When the down times come, we do feel that we're worthless, and why does God even bother? There's nothing good in us. But when it happens, we can take courage, because that same overwhelming discouragement came to so many in the Bible that we read about, that God says they were righteous, they were good, their faith was accounted them as righteousness. They had times of praise
They're
and
in the
joy
hall.
and peace, but they also failed.
They're in the hall of faith of all things.
Exactly. And so that gives us encouragement too, that because we can look back and say, some of God's greatest heroes also had their times where they failed and did what was wrong. Even the New Testament, we see that, and yet we can say that gives us hope, and that gives us encouragement that even when we mess up, God doesn't cast us off. He doesn't say, okay, I'm
Amen.
done with you. I love the fact that years ago I was at a church where the then president of the Southeastern Regional Conference was speaking. And there was a man there that, before the service got started, they were kind of talking about sin and temptation and things like that. And the man, very much was able to tell him, look, God doesn't define you by your sin. He doesn't define you by your mistakes. He doesn't define you by your failures. He said, if you have a problem, say, with stealing, God says, you are my child and I love you and I've accepted you, but you have a problem with stealing and we need to work on that, and I'm here to help you work on it. But he doesn't say, oh, you're a thief, you're a robber. He doesn't identify us with our failures, because he understands our frame, he understands our hearts and our nature, and he says, it's okay, I can help you with that. The blood of Christ covers that.
Amen.
But I can help
Wonderful.
get that out of your life. And so,
That's good news.
yeah. And we shouldn't define ourselves by our failures either, even though we have a tendency to do that.
Yes.
All right.